Greek mythology is full of examples and accounts of same-sex relationships.
Which country is this?
That's the gay flag.
Ah, Greece.
Homosexuality was compulsory.
Same-sex relationships were totally normal.
Who was gayer, Romans or Greeks?
Homoerotic desire.
An elite military unit that was entirely queer.
Same-sex relationships were well known in ancient Greece.
Composed of paired male lovers.
You've probably heard it said before that in ancient Greece, homosexuality was commonplace, even celebrated. Some scholars have even gone so far as to call it a homosexual paradise, where gods and men alike held openly gay relationships that represented the highest ideals of love. But upon what evidence exactly are these claims based? What do the playwrights, the statesmen, and the philosophers, the men whose existence gives ancient Greece a place in our collective conscience, say on the matter of homosexuality? And to what extent might academics' views on modern homosexuality be influencing the conversation? These are the people, after all, who told us that these guys from Pompeii were gay and that this guy was jerking off. But anyway, these above questions will serve as our muse in this video. To begin though, let's clearly and fairly establish the pro-gay argument. They say that, number one, homosexuality was widespread in ancient Greece, mostly in the form of paederasty, an educational but also very sexual relationship between an elder and a minor male. Number two, homosexuality was widely accepted by the populace. And number three, the sexual dynamic between two people is very different from that of today. They say that to the Greeks, it wasn't a matter of homosexual and heterosexual sex, but it was a matter of active versus passive sex, i.e. penetrator and penetrated, and the sex of the partner didn't matter. As long as you're the one doing the penetrating, you were considered the manly one. I contend, contrary to all this, that while of course homosexuality did exist, as it always does, it was extremely limited in scope and hotly contested. What did exist was limited to the practice of pederasty among a small and perverse subset of the elite. Many or even most of the elites opposed this practice because it was clearly harmful to the boys. Meanwhile, adult male-on-male relationships were universally condemned as unnatural and shameful, even among those elites who were actively involved in sexual relationships with little boys. Additionally, the Greeks had such a disdain for male-on-male sexual intercourse that it would be absurd to suggest that they ignored the sex of the participants, even if they didn't have explicit words for homo and heterosexual sex. Now, I have no problem admitting that I am biased in this conversation, but when I search for ancient Greeks were straight on YouTube, I get hundreds of videos telling me that they weren't. So I think my bias is okay and can serve to balance out this conversation a bit. I'm also shown this video telling me that the color blue didn't used to exist, so I don't know which side you want to believe here. So yeah, I am biased, and I was biased just upon hearing this claim because, frankly, as it was presented to me, it didn't seem to make any rational sense. Number one, on the surface, this idea just seems silly. To imagine that practically everybody in ancient Greece was either gay or a pedophile just seems ridiculous. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon, all gay. When we know that today in the US, where homosexuality is at an apex of acceptance, maybe 2% of men identify as gay, and pedophiles are exceedingly rare. Number two, because people tend to argue that the freedom of Greek homosexuality came from a lack of Christian influence on Western thought, it's implied that were we not suppressed by Christian thought, most or all men today would engage in similar pederastic relationships. But this doesn't seem to make sense because we know that nothing similar today exists in any non-Christian nations. Number three, to accept the notion that the Greeks, who produced philosophers famous for their pursuits of self-mastery and self-perfection, would accept as good such wanton sexuality seems unlikely. We're told that practically every elite in the city, despite being steeped in profound philosophical and civic ideas, was following around young boys like a cartoon wolf, and nobody saw it as a problem. Now, this doesn't mean that some gay sex didn't happen. It's common for men not to live up to their ideals, after all. All I'm saying is that it's unlikely that they would have thought of it as good, when they were of the opinion that sex between men can only be done for physical gratification. Number four, would the Greeks have been so highly thought of in the Middle Ages if they were openly gay? This at least suggests that there is a conception of a straight Greek society reasonable enough for all of Europe to accept for over a millennia, for they would not have revered gays so highly. And this is before we even mention the massive and undeniable influence that Greek thought had on Christianity, which you'd think would mean that the two have a lot in common. And lastly, I was opposed to this idea for a higher reason. The idea of a homosexual Greece began to be taken seriously in academia with the publication of Kenneth Dover's book, titled Greek Homosexuality, in 1978. I suspect that this book coming about in the modern age suggests that it has ties to the larger zeitgeist, which sees the West moving towards more and more homosexual acceptance. If the narrative could be spread that the ancient Greeks, those progenitors of much of Western philosophy, managed to develop a societal acceptance of homosexuality, then it would serve as an argument as to either, 1, why we would be better off if homosexuality in its modern form were to become more accepted, or 2, it could be used to deny that the West has any shared heritage and history with this great civilization, both of which I view as factually incorrect. It was for these reasons that I was skeptical whenever I heard the idea that the ancient Greeks were gay, and I decided to launch this investigation. I will be going through dozens of examples from plays, philosophical works, and political works, mostly from classical Athens, as this was the time and place when homosexuality was said to be most widespread. I intend to show exactly what the Greeks would have thought of what we call homosexual relationships, and why calling them gay is frankly absurd. First though, let's get one thing clear. If the question we're really asking is, were the ancient Greeks gay, like how these guys were gay, then I can answer that right away with an emphatic no. I'll expand on this more later in the video, but the effeminate man, especially the one that allowed himself to be the passive partner in a sexual encounter, was referred to as a kinidos, which would best translate into English as a 6-letter F word. These kinidos were constantly the butts of butt jokes in plays, and were even sometimes barred from citizenship in Athens. The logic being that somebody who would allow their desire to overcome their rational mind and the shame that came along with being penetrated by another man was behaving animalistically, unable to control his, quote, itch, foregoing his masculinity for what they believed were, quote, unnatural desires. Such a person could not be trusted with any position of power, as they would be far more likely to behave irrationally in that position. A similar logic was used to bar women from citizenship, and these men were viewed as being even lower than women, because while women were irrational and not to be trusted, obviously, these men were exactly the same, and they didn't even have the upside of producing children. This disdain was focused primarily on the passive partner, but as we will see, it extended to the active partner as well, as he would also be guilty of being unable to control his lust, while simultaneously bringing immense shame on a fellow citizen. And there were many other slurs that were used to describe homosexual men as well, which, although rude, I include for the sake of completeness. These slurs include, in translation, shameless, wide-assed, cistern-assed, gapers, given to unnatural lust, parasital, and those who like to suck, among many others, usually something referring to their anus or their feminine nature. I'll mention here too, since I just have to mention this, the practice of raphanidosis, or the inserting of a large radish in the anus of a man being punished for the crimes of adultery, promiscuity, or sodomy. Looking into the details of this practice really displays the cruel hatred that the Greeks had towards homosexual men. The radish, or sometimes a fish, was inserted, and hot ash was used to singe off the pubic hair of the man, both done in an attempt to feminize and humiliate him. This obvious hatred of homosexuals sets a wide berth between the sexual attitudes of modern gays and the Greeks. Additionally, there is practically no evidence of adult male-on-male romance in any classical literature, which is of course the form in which most gay couples exist today. Nor is there any evidence that marriage between 2 men or 2 women ever occurred or was permitted to occur. So no, the Greeks weren't gay in the modern sense at all. Actually, by today's standards, it'd probably be more apt to call them homophobes. Modern homosexuality is a product of the sexual liberation movement, which champions the idea of complete liberty in regards to one's sexuality, an idea which, as we'll see in the next section, the Greeks would have viewed as terrifyingly stupid. So note that any use of the word gay or homosexual in the rest of the video should just be considered as shorthand, as what male-on-male sex might have occurred in classical Greece has nothing to do with the attitudes and motivating philosophies of modern homosexuality. So instead of asking, were the Greeks gay, our question should really be, to what extent, if any, did male-on-male sex occur in ancient Greece, and what did people think of it? We'll touch on lesbian relationships briefly as well, but frankly, the ancient Greeks were very male-centric in their thinking, so the lives of women rarely get mentioned. Now, to truly understand the complexities of our question, we need to have some background knowledge. Let's begin by discussing nature and love. Nature, to the Greeks, was far from our idealized and distant conception of her. Instead of the romantic vision of the unspoiled Elysium, which we only occasionally venture into for pleasure, nature represented chaos, fear, and unpredictability, something to be held at bay by human culture, civilization, and reason. The forest was not an idyllic setting for a walk, but a dark place, full of often vengeful trickster spirits, the king of whom was Pan, the malevolent satyr, and the inspiration for the depiction of the Christian devil with horns and cloven hoof. It was said that if one was to defile nature, the punishment would be sodomy by the god himself, which, as a side note, I fail to see how sex with a god would be punishment if everyone was gay. Likewise, the sea was viewed with similar fear by the Greeks. Because sailing vessels were fairly primitive and advanced storm detection impossible, Sailing the Mediterranean was often deadly, a prospect which was all the more frightening because if somebody's body was not recovered and given a proper burial, their soul would be stuck in limbo for eternity. This led some to refuse travel by sea altogether, including the famous Hesiod, who claims to have only boarded a ship once for a very short trip. A short section of the Odyssey displays this disdain towards nature at work. Before encountering the famous Cyclops Polyphemus, Odysseus' crew spends the night on a small nearby island, which is totally devoid of human occupation. This passage describes the pristine landscape, the abundant herds of wild goats, the perfect terrain, the natural harbor, all aspects which to the modern reader sound like an untouched paradise that we would seek to preserve at all costs. But Odysseus is just downright angry that the island has so much wasted potential, that it could be settled by humans if only the nearby Cyclopses, who are themselves a representation of wild nature with their savage ways, would not ruin the property value so much. There are many other stories which illustrate the rivalry that the Greeks felt towards nature, not least of which are the countless stories of the fear that the people had towards their gods, many of whom are aspects of nature, such as Poseidon, who represents the ocean. Far from our happy view of nature as something beautiful, something to be untouched as in our national parks, the Greeks knew her dangers. They knew that it was up to the rational, humanizing forces of reason and civilization to constantly hold back the tide which would throw them all back into the chaos. For this reason, they were intensely skeptical of forces which they saw as acting on behalf of wild nature. Which brings us to another key part to the puzzle of Greek love is their societal attitudes towards women, which were very different from our enlightened attitudes today. Whereas men were defined by their more acute use of reason, which allowed for the safety and predictability of civilization, women, whose behavior was considered to be more emotional and instinctual, and whose bodies followed the cycles of nature, were considered to be beings closer to that violent and unpredictable nature, and therefore could not be trusted as men could be. Hence the upper-class practice of rarely allowing their wives to leave their houses. To be sure, men were also subject to the forces of nature, such as Eros, who we will discuss next. But it was a matter of degrees. Women were far more controlled by these irrational passions than men. For this reason, women tended to take the role of trouble starters in Greek stories. See, for example, the play by Aristophanes titled Assemblywomen, which plays for laughs the idea of the Athenian government being run entirely by women, who quickly structure society to satisfy their uncontrolled sexual desires. They also decide to ban all private wealth and basically set up a communist state. Now, on the surface, this play seems damning of women, but it actually goes deeper, because this was intended as a critique of contemporary Athenian politics. And the worst insult that Aristophanes could come up with was to call all the congressmen women. We're all familiar, too, with Helen, often blamed for starting the Trojan War, and with Pandora, sent to Earth as a punishment by Zeus. Pandora is the perfect example to explain Greek attitudes towards women. Her famous box, when opened, brought destruction upon mankind, and this was likely an allegory for women's sexuality. Since it was closer to wild and untrustworthy nature, it wreaked havoc when uncontrolled. But even so, you may remember that at the bottom of the box was hope, which represents the ultimately necessary reproductive power of women to create new citizens who will in turn uphold civilization. And to be balanced, it's not as if men didn't love their wives and vice versa. Most famously, Odysseus' wife Penelope displays incredible loyalty and love towards him, going so far as to hold out hope for decades, waiting for him to return from war, and helping him kill all the suitors who had invaded his home. But on the whole, women were quite often derided for their uncontrolled passions, which put their existence more in line with wild nature than men, who needed to control them with reason, while utilizing their chaotic sexual powers to create the next generation of citizens who would continue the cycle of civilization. When discussing Greek homosexuality, you may imagine the most important deity to be the goddess of love, Aphrodite. But it would actually be more appropriate to discuss it in terms of the god Eros, the god of desire, since homosexuality was often viewed as an unnatural proclivity. And there are several misconceptions about Eros that we must first clean up. To begin, although his Roman counterpart is Cupid, and we tend therefore to imagine him as a harmless cherub spreading romantic love, the truth was very different. Eros, as a feeling that people could have, is not really love at all. Take, for example, in the Iliad, where soldiers eating are described as, quote, satisfying their eros for food. Eros would rather best be described as a passion, and a violent one at that, which, if left unchecked, could lead people to the worst forms of self-destruction. It was a feeling which would make people abandon their reason, and invite in the ever-looming chaos of nature into the well-ordered polis. It could be directed towards a person, of course, but also to fame, wealth, or any object. Also removing Eros from our cherubesque image of him is his parentage, being born of Aphrodite and the god of war Ares, as well as the fact that he was said to watch over battlefields and actually provided warriors their frenzied mindset. Remember too that he literally shoots people with arrows, often regarded as the weapon of a coward who was unwilling to fight up close. And arrows are the perfect metaphor for the idea that they were trying to get across, since a barbed arrowhead lodged in someone's flesh could not be pulled out, and would therefore fester and likely ultimately kill the person, the same as an uncontrolled passion could. And while it's popularly known that Eros shoots golden arrows of desire which cause people to fall in love, it's usually forgotten that he has another type of arrow with lead tips that causes repulsion. Often he would shoot two would-be lovers with these opposite arrows, causing intense emotional suffering for both. There are countless examples from Greek literature which display their understanding of Eros as an irrational force of destruction. Take the play The Bacchae, in which Thebes becomes ruled by the forces of Eros, where all desire is allowed to be satisfied. That play ends with the destruction of Thebes by fire. Or Jason and the Argonauts, where Medea is compelled by Eros to fall in love with Jason and help him steal the golden fleece from her father's possession. While we may view this as romantic, I'll remind you that Medea, in her blind love, ends up betraying and helping to kill her brother. And when she attempts to flee with Jason on his boat, she dismembers the body of her child and throws it in the ocean, in an attempt to slow down her pursuing father, who feels compelled to gather the body parts of his grandchild so that he may receive a proper burial. Needless to say, this would not have been viewed as a romantic story by the Greeks, but as a cautionary tale of how uncontrolled Eros can destroy a family. Ultimately, Eros was far more feared than he was loved. He was still understood to be necessary, as passion is the driving force behind much of human action, but extremely dangerous if uncontrolled, a view explained well in Plato's Phaedrus, which we will discuss later. Eros is fire, which we need for life but will also burn our house down. Eros is the wild horse pulling our chariot, whose energies the driver must harness, and he, like all gods, must be feared. With this background knowledge established, we can now truly understand the context of the conversation the Greeks were having. Let's begin with the big one, the institution of pederasty. Many on the pro-gay side argue that homosexuality mostly existed in the form of pederasty, so let's examine that claim. I will first state that nobody knows for certain how often pederastic relationships became sexual, and anybody who deals in absolutes on the subject is probably trying to sell you something. Any conclusions are gleaned from disconnected passages from dozens of different books, and these just the ones that have happened to have survived. Even when we do get an example of somebody mentioning pederasty directly, their stance on it is not always entirely clear. Take the speech of Pausanias in Plato's Symposium, probably the most cited work on the subject of pederasty. Pausanias, a real homosexual man, says that the Athenian and Dorian customs on the matter of pederasty are, quote, complex and not easy to comprehend, for they are at once shameful and honorable. And later in the same work, we have Socrates, who at this time is presented by Plato as a proponent of pederasty, mentioning the fact that in order to protect their children from the sexual advances of elderly men in the elite, parents would hire bodyguards for their children, and other children would often mock a youth caught up in a pederastic relationship. So the subject of pederasty is not one we can completely understand one way or the other. But I still think there was enough said on the subject that we can begin to paint a clearer picture. To begin, let's establish clearly what pederasty was. It was a type of relationship common among upper-class citizens of Athens and many other city-states of the time and region. The relationship was between an older man called the Erastes, or lover, and a younger male called the Eromenos, or the loved one. The Eromenos being anywhere from 12 to around 18 years old at max, and the Erastes being really any age so long as he was older by a wide enough margin. These relationships were intended to educate the youth and raise them up to understand the political and societal norms they would need to uphold as future citizens. And since Athens lacked any formal higher education at this time, a relationship with a wealthy and well-connected Erastes would probably be the best way to prepare yourself for a career in politics. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking that if they weren't gay, why did they call each other lovers? But you gotta remember that we're dealing with translations here. Remember that eros, the same eros in the word eromenos, is not a romantic feeling, but an intense, animating passion towards anything. Food, learning, entertainment, or, yes, sometimes people. The eros directed towards the eromenos should be thought of as a passion to raise up a good citizen, to see instilled in them your wisdom, to attain pride in their eventual success, to attain respect from the community, for ensuring that your well-taught student will continue to uphold the values which keep your civilization thriving. This is the most important fact on the matter, that the relationship was intended as one between mentor and mentee. But according to the pro-gay argument, and Wikipedia in the first sentence even, it was an explicitly homosexual relationship. Education isn't even mentioned on the Wikipedia entry for pederasty. But this is frankly absurd and incredibly misleading. There are several ancient sources that explicitly state that the intention of pederasty was educational and not sexual. Take Xenophon, for instance, where he plainly says as much about Spartan pederasty. Also take the book by gay activist and professor William Armstrong Percy, titled Paederasty and Pedagogy in Archaic Greece. In it, he argues that pederasty contributed to the meteoric rise of Athens. How does it make any sense that a purely sexual institution would cause the rise of a city-state? So to claim that the purpose of pederasty was only sexual and not educational at all is just plain wrong. But here's the rub. There do exist several passages from ancient literature which do display a sexual attraction of the Erastes towards his Eromenos. Most famous are the passages from Plato, especially in his earlier works. But to examine these statements and not examine the myriad opinions which come from the other side of the elite will give people a false idea of homosexuality in Greece. In fact, being exposed to only quotes like this is probably why the belief is so widespread. There are so many examples of writings which explicitly denounce sexual pederasty. Take Xenophon again, where he says that the ancient Spartan ruler, Lycurgus, viewed sexual pederasty in the same vein as incest. Or take Claudius Aelianus, a Roman historian writing in the 3rd century AD, who shared similar sentiments on the subject in his Varia Historia. And in Athens, the views seem to be much the same. Take this law, which was cited in the trial of Timarchus versus Aetius, where it is explained that any adult men who were caught sneaking into the schools or the gymnasiums while boys were present would be put to death. Aristotle, too, often denounced sexual pederasty. Take this passage from the Nicomachean Ethics, in which he refers to the practice as a disease, akin to plucking out one's hair or eating dirt, and says that it arises from being abused as a child. Look too at the erotic essays attributed to Demosthenes, where the form of idealized pederasty is defended. He makes extremely clear the non-sexual nature of the relationship by describing how the just lover ought to behave, that he should be chaste and favor behavior that is just and beautiful rather than shameful. He says that to seek physical gratification from his beloved would be an outrage, that he must ensure his love is properly instructed in the virtues and learns how to control his passions. Now sure, you might say that he was just writing what he thought everyone else wanted to hear. But at the very least, that proves that that is what he thought everyone else wanted to hear, that that was the prevailing opinion, that pederasty should not be sexual. And lastly, take even Plato, the man I cited above as being pro-pederasty, who in his later books, and especially his last book titled Laws, had a complete change of heart on the subject. In this book, he refers to homosexual sex as unnatural, an outrage on nature, a capital surrender to the lust of pleasure. He states that it makes one lower than an animal, likens it to whoring, and says that, quote, sexual intercourse between men should be once and for all prohibited. Now, I don't want this video to be citations ad nauseum, so I'll stop here, but just know that I could continue on for quite a while with this. To me, it seems that while there are several extant pro-pederastic mentions in literature, they tend to be very subdued, use language that is metaphorical, and they never once refer to actual sex, penetrative or otherwise. And this fact belies what the other quotes display to be an obvious shame felt by those who practiced sexual pederasty. They, like all Athenians, had a strong distaste for homosexual sex as an effeminizing act. And they must have known that forcing a young boy into a sexual relationship that he had no way of understanding was not ultimately to the boy's benefit, to put it lightly. To me, it seems abundantly clear that the prevailing opinion on the matter was that the ideal pederastic relationship was chaste, and those who sought physical gratification from their eromenos were looked down upon as being unable to control their eros, also not setting a good example for their eromenos, and what's worse, harming the child and potentially turning him into a dreaded kenidos. This is not to say that sex did not occur between lover and loved, but we have no reason to believe that it was very common, and it certainly was not accepted as those in the pro-gay camp would have you believe. And really just think about the idea that they're trying to sell you here. Does it really make sense that a society which viewed passive homosexuality with such radish inserting disdain would really force the boys that they were training to become men to practice it? And even if it did happen, which again, sure, of course it did, would society writ large deem it good? Which is the claim being made by the pro-gay side when they call Athens a homosexual paradise. So not only do we have countless examples of prominent Athenians denouncing the practice, but it would be completely counterproductive to what they were trying to accomplish in the first place. Now, there is an explanation for how those involved in a pederastic relationship could still be considered straight. I'll try to explain it how I've seen it argued, but frankly, it kind of baffles me. What they normally say is that the idea of homosexual and heterosexual didn't exist. The Greeks didn't even have words for these concepts, in fact. Sex was conceived of in terms of the active and the passive partner. The sex of the participants did not matter. As long as you were the active one, you were the manly one. So it was okay for the Erastes to have his eromenos gratify him.
Ain't nothing gay about getting your dick sucked.
And simultaneously, they say that it was okay for the eromenos to gratify his Erastes because he was benefiting from the education he was receiving.
Ain't nothing gay about sucking dick.
A little suspicious if you ask me, because it would be obvious that ideally the boy would just receive an education without the statutory rape, but I don't know. Also, this idea that because the word homosexual didn't exist, the people couldn't possibly conceive of the concept is just absurd. The word homosexual was only coined in 1868. By their logic, all English-speaking people before that date didn't know what homosexuality was. Medieval monks, the Puritans, totally okay with it. I want to bring up too how perverse it should be considered that these people cite pederasty in their bid to normalize the idea of a gay ancient Greece, which in turn normalizes the idea of a gay modernity. Now, of course, they have to rely on pederasty because, as mentioned above, there is absolutely zero evidence of adult male-on-male relationships, but it's still sickening. Even in the introduction to the Wikipedia article on pederasty, it's mentioned how such relationships can lead to PTSD and mental problems in the future. Remember that the younger partner, the eromenos, could be as young as 12. It was also widely believed that the youth should not receive any satisfaction in his role as the passive partner, which paints the disturbing image of a young boy not totally aware of what's happening to him, as he's being taken advantage of by some 40-year-old guy who's always super nice to him and gives him gifts. This is not the kind of evidence that you want to use as a proponent of homosexuality today. Cultural relativism cannot be applied to everything. Some things are just evil. And the Greeks, who gave us much of the foundation of Western morality, would have known this better than most. What acceptance of pederasty there was, I think it's fair to say, was probably created in large part by a cycle of trauma. Psychology today has displayed clearly the damage that can be done to victims of sexual abuse at a young age. I mean, can you imagine the mental state of this 12-year-old who's brought into a relationship with this older man, perhaps a friend of his father's, and he's super nice to him all the time and gives him gifts, but then requires that he stands there and takes it every so often. This would continue until that boy was 18, is told he's no longer beautiful, and was abandoned for a younger boy. I think it's fair to say that this child would be far more likely to in the future become an abuser himself, or to turn into a kanidos and face the intense shame that came along with that role. So to state that pederasty was widely accepted, to not question the harm that it wrought on the boys, and then to use it as an argument to prove that ancient Greece was gay is incredibly idiotic. What sexual pederasty did exist was shameful even to those practicing it, and denounced by those who weren't as degenerate. The existence of pederastic scenes on pottery was one of the main points used in support of the pro-gay argument by Kenneth Dover in his book Greek Homosexuality, which it turns out is basically the source of using pottery to promote the idea of a gay Greece. He claims that of the roughly 80,000 Greek pottery samples from the classical era, 600 of them, or about 1%, depict homosexual scenes. This claim is dealt with in detail by Adonis Georgiadis, author of the book Homosexuality in Ancient Greece, The Myth is Collapsing, whose work I will be citing to deal with this question. To begin, he points out that when it came time for Dover to present the catalog of these 600 vases, he prefaced it by saying, quote, "The vases listed here are those mentioned in the book. By no means all of them portray homosexual behavior or bear erotic inscriptions." So in other words, he completely made up this figure of 600, and a great many of them do not even depict anything remotely homosexual. Now, how many of these made-up items were included in the 600? I'm not really sure. But according to Georgiadis, who went through the catalog himself, only 30 actually depicted homosexual scenes. And that was with what he called a generous interpretation, including sexual scenes of non-humans like satyrs in his count. To prove how much of a stretch Dover was making in some of these interpretations, here are some of the vases that he decided to include in that group of 600. One vase displays heterosexual sex, in which, quote, this is Dover, "If one looks carefully, he will remark that the coitus is through the anus. This means that the artist subconsciously wants to paint a homosexual scene, but he can't." Another pot depicts a scene in which, according to Dover, quote, "Orestes, advancing to kill Aegisthus, holds a broad-bladed, curved, sharp-pointed sword in a position where it covers his genitals and appears to be projecting from him." And Dover thought this was a subtle innuendo for sex somehow. And lastly, a vase which includes a scene in which, quote, "Iolaus holds his club so that it looks like his own erect penis, and Heracles, fighting the lion, appears to have his scabbard going up his anus." So clearly there was some padding going on with that 600 figure cited by Dover. But I have not verified Georgiadis' number of 30 myself. So I think it's fair to say that the real number is somewhere in the middle, perhaps shying more towards 30, given just how brazen Dover was in some of his interpretations. This puts the percentage of pottery depicting some form of homosexual sex as low as 0.04%, which I don't know, I have no way of knowing this, but that's probably about the percentage of art online that's just furry porn. This low percentage also explains why, if you look for examples of gay pottery, you get the same handful of images over and over again, like they're trying to give the illusion that it was way more common than it was. Georgiadis also notes that of all of these pots, not a single one depicts homosexual sex. There is anal sex depicted, but it is done only by satyrs, who were well known for being sexually perverted. So given just how rarely these homosexual scenes were depicted, we really cannot use pottery to point to any widespread acceptance of homosexuality in ancient Greece. And this is before we even point out that any pottery like this would have been made entirely for or by the elites, as they would have been the only ones who could actually have afforded it. And even among them, who were the only ones that engaged in sexual, pederastic relationships, only 0.04% of all their pottery depicted homosexual scenes. But really, we didn't even have to examine the vases to know that this explanation has some problems. We should have already known that one has to be careful when they are interpreting art without the proper context. After all, what would someone 2,500 years from now think of our age if they dug up a copy of the book Lolita? And that book was made in the 50s when they made stuff like this.
One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal, and it may be too late when you discover he is mentally ill.
So on the whole, the pottery argument is very weak, and it does nothing to support the idea of a widespread homosexual acceptance. But despite this, this was the main supporting evidence used in the book that popularized the gay Greek myth in the first place. So pederasty and pottery now dealt with, there really aren't any other aspects of Greek life that have even an iota of homosexuality. So all I can do right now is list them for you to prove that they really didn't talk about being gay that often. Let's begin with Greek stories. Now, judging by modernity, a homosexual society cannot help but write stories about male-on-male love. But did the Greeks do this? Let's start with the most important Greek stories, those of Greek myth, and specifically the gods. Let's ask the question, do any of the gods have homosexual relationships? Well, let's see. Aphrodite has Ares as a love and Hephaestus as a husband, who, by the way, wanted to marry Athena, but she was chaste. Aphrodite also had amorous relationships with many mortals, all men, such as Aeneas and Adonis. Ares in his own right has Eos. Zeus has Hera as a wife, and oh yeah, by the way, has sex with everybody. But weirdly no men. Hades has Persephone, Poseidon has the sea nymph Amphitrite as well as Medusa, Eros has Psyche, Erebus has Nyx, Dionysus has Ariadne. Even the somewhat perverse Titans were all hetero, with Atlas and Pleione, Oceanus and Tithys, Gaia and Uranus, not happy but hetero, and Kronos and Rhea. Any story that people claim represents gay Greek gods, at least any of the ones that I've come across, explicitly represent chaste love of the soul, or in the case of Dionysus and Pan, homosexual rape sometimes. It's probably fair to note that most of these stories come from before the classical era, and there's little contention that anything outside of the classical era was very gay. But it's still important to mention them because these are the stories that would have made up the cultural milieu of even classical Athens, and they are all heterosexual. The one story of the gods which is used most often to attempt to paint Greece as gay is the story of Zeus and Ganymede. Ganymede was a youth from Troy whom Zeus admired, so he made him immortal to serve forever as his personal cupbearer on Mount Olympus. Now, the question we have to ask about this story and what leads to all the confusion is that Zeus says that he loves Ganymede. Does this mean that he is gay? I certainly don't think so. Although this point might be lost on a lot of moderns, it's entirely possible to love somebody without having sex with them. But we'll discuss more of this later. Even Plato, the sometimes pro-pederastic cheerleader, disagreed that the relationship was sexual. He said that any homosexual attraction that Zeus was said to have for Ganymede was likely to have come from the Cretans to justify their own sexual perversions. Plato also suggests a heterosexual reading of the story, saying that the love between the two was completely chaste. So in short, any mention of a relationship between two men does not instantly make them gay. Which brings us to the most maligned, misunderstood couple in history, Achilles and Patroclus. I mean, surely these two guys from the Iliad are gay, right? They are described as loving each other, after all. Frankly, I think this myth can only be believed by people who haven't read the Iliad. One of the main plot points is that Achilles refuses to fight after King Agamemnon steals his concubine, Briseis, from him, who is a female concubine, by the way. But if you need more hetero reassurance on these two, number one, the first time Patroclus is mentioned, it is prefixed by the words, Achilles' friend. Number two, Achilles explicitly says that he loves Briseis, his female concubine, and that he wants to return home with her and make her his wife. Number three, Homer never describes them as gay. Never even alludes to it, but he does explicitly mention them having sex with women multiple times. On this point, I've actually heard some scholars argue that this was only because everybody knew what would have been going on. They didn't need to explicitly mention that they were gay, which is like, should we just assume that everything else that wasn't mentioned is true and everything that was mentioned is false? I also contend that even if they were gay, which again there's zero evidence for and a lot of evidence against, it would have been unimportant to the depth of their bond. The deepest connection that two people can feel is one of the soul, not of the body, and the Greeks understood this more than most. If Achilles did have sex with Patroclus or not, it wouldn't have made his grief at seeing his dead body any less intense. By the way, did you know that gay men are by far the most sexually promiscuous group in the world? According to a 2014 study, the average gay man will have 30 sexual partners in his life, with 30% of gays having over 50. Are all of these sexual encounters the start of intense, soul-bonded love that will make you willing to die for the other guy? Or are they just meaningless hookups? Because of this reason, the Achilles and Patroclus couple idea fails completely a priori. And that's before you even read the book, whereupon all doubt will be completely removed. How about the story of Orpheus, which is often used by the pro-gay side, like in this article here? Indeed, he was so successful in proselytizing for homosexuality that he upset the local female followers of Dionysus, god of wine and drama. For those of you who don't know, Orpheus the musician tried but failed to delve into Hades to save his wife Eurydice after she had passed away. After this failure, he became so distraught that he gave up on women entirely, and, according to this article, also became gay. Now, I'm not sure if this story can really tell us much about how widespread homosexual acceptance was in Greece at the time, but if it tells us anything, it's probably not positive, because the story ends with Orpheus being dismembered by an angry mob. But wait a minute. Are we really expected to believe that a man who would travel to hell to save his dead wife was really just gay all along? What does the story actually say on this? Well, in the most famous version by Ovid, right after Orpheus just lost his wife, after almost rescuing her from Hades, and falls into a deep depression, we get just one line dealing with sexuality, and it reads, "Since Orpheus fled the face of womankind, and all soft union with the sex declined." You can pause the video to read the full passage here. My question is, how would this imply that this guy is gay? I mean, this guy watched his wife die twice and was sent into a bout of depression. But this is typical of the type of proof that the pro-gay side tends to use. It's as if they're really just banking on you not looking this stuff up yourself. And this isn't just Ovid's version. Virgil's version ends with Orpheus being depressed for months while he walks around Hyperborea. And it's only because this absolute Chad neglects women for so long that they end up killing him out of jealousy. There's not even a mention of his involvement with men, not even as friends. There are, of course, many other equally famous stories from the Greeks, but none of these are used to support the idea of a homosexual Greece, even though you know they would love to try. Jason and the Argonauts? A bunch of fit young men on a boat all alone? I mean, come on. Of course, there's the difficulty that Jason ends up marrying the enchantress Medea in the end. Then there's the Odyssey, a tale of a bunch of old men alone on a boat. But of course, the entire point of that story is that Odysseus is trying to return home to his loving wife. There are so many other stories too, which all exclusively depict heterosexual relationships, but I'm not going to discuss these all here in the interest of time. The only example of homosexual attraction that I can think of in Greek stories is with Narcissus, but to be fair, he's just attracted to himself. And the only example of homosexual sex is the rape of Chrysippus by Laius. Because of this act, however, Chrysippus ends up committing suicide, and Laius has a curse placed on his family, which ends up destroying them all in the famous play Oedipus Rex. Yes, it was homosexual rape why Oedipus was cursed. He was the son of Laius. But again, we're mostly dealing with stories here from before the classical period. What if we look at stories from the classical period itself? Well, the best way to do this would be to look at plays, a common form of entertainment for all Athenians. The problem is that these two paint a picture of a very heteronormative culture. Take the play Lysistrata, for example, one of the most famous plays of ancient Athens, wherein the women decide to refuse sex with their husbands until they stop the war with Sparta. And by the way, this works. They decide to end the war. Why would this work if everyone was gay? We can look too at the other plays of Aristophanes. For example, in his comedy The Clouds, which starts off with two guys sleeping in separate beds, and one keeps getting woken up by the other guy's fart. Really highbrow stuff here. The gay comes in 1,200 lines later, in a scene where one guy mentions that after they had been sitting down, boys would have to wipe the sand away from their seat, so the imprints of their butts didn't get any old men too excited. Now, to me, in this play that's basically non-stop toilet humor satirizing intellectuals, this comes off as a joke, and it's pretty funny. But academics don't like funny, so they take this as gospel. Seriously, they say that because characters like this existed in a play, it proves that they were commonplace in society. But this play also says that philosophy exists so that you may better lie to people. It would be like saying because you made a joke about Jared Fogle, that proves that you were okay with what that guy did. And one more fun fact about Aristophanes. Scatological humor was commonplace in all of his comedies, including characters that, although they were not old, they had difficulty controlling their defecation, and they were ridiculed for it. And this was probably a reference to damage that was done to them as a young Eromenos. And this is just another example of homophobia that was commonplace in their culture. Next, let's examine some claims that are made about historical figures. You've perhaps heard it said that Alexander was gay himself, or at least bisexual. This idea is based largely on the fact that he was very distraught when his male best friend Hephaestion died. This claim is made despite the fact that we have sources telling us that Alexander likely enjoyed a different woman's company every night. We know that he wasn't a fan of pederasty either, which we can surmise from this quote by Plutarch, in which Alexander violently denies the offer of a boy's company made to him by an Eastern king. And the normality of homosexuality in the culture is also largely disproven by Alexander's life. Firstly, in the story we have that tells us that Alexander's father sent a female prostitute to his room when he was 14 to ensure that the boy didn't turn gay. Why would the king care that his son was gay if everybody was so accepting of it? You could say that he just wanted to make sure that Alexander could produce an heir. But surely even a gay man could be forced to have straight sex to produce heirs, and then what he did in his free time wouldn't really be that important, right? Also disproving this idea is the fact that Alexander's conquest was stopped when all his men wanted desperately to return home to see their wives. But surely the smorgasbord of an all-male army would have been the ideal for a gay society. I also want to examine the Sacred Band of Thebes, a semi-mythical cohort of 300 men who were the elite guard of that city. The Sacred Band was said to be composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. Were these guys actually real? Were they actually gay? First though, a note on this video, remember that because these men are acting in a feminine way, the Greeks would have viewed them as unnatural and shameful, which makes you wonder if depicting the sacred band like this was really just an attempt to form the image of Greeks as modern gays in our minds. Anyways, the only source for the sacred band's existence is Plutarch, in his writings on Pelopides, the group's leader. Importantly, Plutarch was writing about 500 years after the group had ceased to exist, and he really didn't write more than a few sentences about them at all, and he certainly made no mention of them engaging in homosexual sex. It's possible too that the story of them being lovers was one that was influenced by classical Athens, where the idea that an army of lovers would be invincible was popular in aristocratic and philosophical circles at the time, like in this quote by Plato. Notice the line about them abstaining from all dishonor. This in a culture which viewed being a bottom as inherently dishonorable. So how is it possible that they would maintain their honor, but also have sex with each other? To me, the story of the sacred band speaks more to our own culture's shallowness than anything. To the hormone-addled, early 30-something urbanite, it has become impossible to imagine forming a relationship with another human that doesn't involve sex, so it becomes easy for them to accept the gay Greeks' theory. But the deepest relationships that you have in your life are non-sexual, or if they are, it's not what's important. You don't get married for sex, or at least you shouldn't. Think about the bonds you have with your father, your mother, your siblings, your childhood best friend who knows everything about you. These relationships are all completely asexual, but you're pathetic if you don't feel the deepest, most profound sense of love towards these people. And the bond that is formed on the battlefield is, I am told, perhaps the closest you can feel attached to someone. I've known of soldiers who fought together for a matter of weeks who have the most indescribably close bond with each other, and no, they're not gay at all. But the bond is so powerful that it can't be described by any other goddess besides love. This is how the Greeks understood it. This is her nature. Our conception of her is so bankrupt of meaning that we immediately assume that the sacred band were all boning each other when they're referred to as lovers, when in reality, even if they were having sex, this would be an insignificant aspect of their relationship. For completeness, I want to talk briefly about Sappho, the female archaic poet who lived from around 630 to 570 BC. She was widely regarded as an extremely talented lyric poetess at the time, with Plato referring to her as the 10th muse. Her poems have been interpreted as displaying homoerotic desire for other women. This fact, along with the fact that she lived on the island of Lesbos, gives us the modern term lesbian. But was Sappho truly gay? Well, more so than even with classical Athens, there's a difficulty in the fact that our primary sources are extremely lacking. While Sappho probably wrote a lot of poetry, we only have 700 lines of her poetry remaining today, with only one poem surviving in its entirety. Here's the fragment which I think most clearly insinuates her possible homosexuality. And even this, frankly, does not extend beyond innuendo. I frankly don't know if we can say, one way or the other, if she was gay. It's entirely up to your interpretation of her poems, but most of them were destroyed by Christians when they took power. I actually would be okay with accepting the idea that she was probably gay, but to present the other side of the argument, firstly, she was known to be married. This doesn't necessarily mean she wasn't gay, but still. Number two, according to Ovid, Sappho died after throwing herself from a window because of heartbreak from a ferryman. Scholars are usually quick to dismiss this claim as hetero-whitewashing, but should they? I mean, he was around at a time when more of her works would have been extant. There's also a much earlier reference to the same idea in the 4th century BC, in a surviving fragment of a play from Meander called the Leucadia. Again, we can speculate endlessly as to what extent this represents a mythologization of Sappho or a hetero-whitewashing or whatever, and I'll leave that up to you. I'm just presenting the evidence that a supposed lesbian killed herself over being spurned by a man. Some scholars have suggested that Sappho's lesbian status was created by comic poets from rival cities, wishing to mock those from Mytilene for their emancipation of women. Also, amusingly, the verb lesbiazen, which literally translates to act like a person from Lesbos, did not refer to homosexual women, but to giving a blowjob. I only include this to show that the idea of lesbianism certainly wasn't around at the time. Ultimately, there is very little that we can say about Sappho as a person, let alone about her sexuality. The scraps of her work that survive supply tantalizing references just substantial enough to convince those with a political agenda of their absolute meaning. But we can't say anything definitive one way or the other. But gay women will always use her as an icon because the evidence that we have is so perfectly ambiguous. I'll make a quick mention too of the physicians of the time, who were having a really hard time figuring out what caused homosexuality. Serranus of Ephesus was looking for an explanation as to why some men were gay, as to why they act so contrary to their nature. According to him, the popular conclusion was that it was a disease, which caused their lust to be greater than their shame. But Serranus, taking a view contrary to the orthodoxy, stated that being gay was not a physical disease, merely a mental illness. It's noted also that the pre-Socratic philosopher, Parmenides, considered homosexuality as a birth defect. But whatever the explanation, physicians could not view homosexuality as anything other than an error. So in conclusion, to say that the ancient Greeks were gay is completely incorrect. To say that it was a homosexual paradise is frankly absurd. For every one tepid endorsement of homosexual pederasty that academics attempt to tease out of ancient literature, we have 10 sources that explicitly denounce it as degenerate. Of the hundreds of tales from Greek mythology and popular culture, not one mentions an explicitly gay couple. As low as 0.04% of all pottery found depicts scenes that are in any way homosexual. And the number is only this high if you stretch it to include depictions of mythological creatures. Greek law never allowed for gay marriage, and men who were found guilty of sodomy were sometimes publicly sodomized with a radish as punishment. The limited homosexuality that did exist was only in the form of sexual pederasty among a small and perverse subset of the elites. Not entirely unlike today, what we have amongst our own elites. But these practices in no way reflect the sentiments of the general populace, any more than the Lolita Express represents our complacency with modern pederasty. I think a historian looking back at today would assume that we tolerate the abuse of children, judging from how many visitors to Epstein's Island have been arrested. Think about how often homosexuality is depicted in our culture versus in Greek culture. Whereas they had a handful of pottery pieces among tens of thousands, and some indirect references in a book by Plato, our modern culture seems unable to produce a piece of media without the inclusion of a gay character, even if they're out of place. Things have gone way further here than they ever went in ancient Greece. And yet only 5% of people living in New York City, basically gay Mecca, say that they identify as gay. And complete homosexual acceptance is far from a reality even there. Think about what this might suggest about how accepted being gay really was in ancient Greece. I reject this idea of a gay Greece, because aside from all the evidence that proves it ridiculous, I feel that all living in the West have an inextricable link to our forebears, that human nature tends not to change, and that we are the same people as those that came before us. That our morality is ultimately based on what we find to be the fundamental truths of the world. To suggest that the morality of the Greeks was so drastically different from our own is necessarily to say that we share no deeper connection with them. It is nothing less than an attempt to sap the strong foundation of Western society which they developed and left as an inheritance for us all. So I encourage you all to reject this idea of a gay ancient Greece in the future. Instead, understand the subject with the nuance that it deserves. And always be aware of what thoughts you are allowing to enter your mind, and consider them all deeply before you accept them.